In the last part of the series, part 51, we saw the Apostle Paul and his companions persecuted for the sake of the gospel. We first saw Timothy join Paul, and then Paul and his companions were led by the Holy Spirit to start the church in Philippi. We then saw Paul cast out a spirit and a fortune teller and go to prison where Elohim freed them, but they did not leave. This led to the prison guard himself and his household being baptized and saved. We saw the power of the gospel and of the Holy Spirit by those that place the gospel as the priority in their lives. Using them as examples for us, it can help build conviction and strength that we need to do the will of Elohim in these last days. There is nothing in this world more important to discuss than the gospel, and it is up to us to be vessels of truth so that others can be saved and produce righteous fruit. It can be hard to do today with so much clutter and confusion, but the good news is that the Bible has enough instruction that will give us great solid foundation that will sustain us through all that we endure. Let's dig in and continue in the book of Acts and understand what the Father wants us to know. Let's begin. Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Then Paul, as his custom was, went into them, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and demonstrating that the Messiah had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, "This Yahshua, whom I preach to you, is the Messiah." And some of them were persuaded, and a great multitude of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women, joined Paul and Silas. But the Jews who were not persuaded, becoming envious, took some of the evil men from the marketplace, and gathering a mob, set all the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, and sought to bring them out to the people. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some brethren to the rulers of the city, crying out, "These who have turned the world upside down have come here too. Jason has harbored them, and these are all acting contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king, Yahshua." And they troubled the crowd and the rulers of the city when they heard these things. So when they had taken security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. Then the brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. When they arrived, they went into the synagogue of the Jews. These were more fair-minded than those in Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness and searched the Scriptures daily to find out whether these things were so. Therefore, many of them believed, and also not a few of the Greeks, prominent women as well as men. But when the Jews from Thessalonica learned that the word of Elohim was preached by Paul at Berea, they came there also and stirred up the crowds. Then immediately the brethren sent Paul away to go to the sea, but both Silas and Timothy remained there. So those who conducted Paul brought him to Athens, and receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him with all speed, they departed. This is what these men had to go through so that we know of the gospel today. They were persecuted, threatened, beaten, imprisoned, falsely accused, cast out of cities. This was the church. They sacrificed and endured a great deal for the kingdom of Elohim. Many of us have heard of Paul's missionary journeys, but we should just understand it through looking at a map, and then we will truly understand what he was really doing. In this group of scriptures, he went to Thessalonica. This is where the Thessalonian church was, who he wrote to in 2 letters. He stayed there 3 weeks and visited the synagogues, reasoning with the Jews why Yahshua was the Messiah. He read through the Old Testament scriptures, the words of the prophets and of the law of Moses, and explained why Yahshua was the Messiah. He even convinced some of the devout Greeks. Now, as he was preaching, the Jews that did not believe stirred up trouble for Paul. It's very much like what people do today when they hear parts of the gospel that they do not want to accept. They wanted to really get Paul and Silas. They created mobs. In 49 AD, Roman Emperor Claudius expelled all Jews from Rome due to riots that were ignited by a group of zealous Jews. They were plotting insurrection and revolution against Rome, and were opposing the installation of a new king. When the Jews accused Paul and Silas of acting contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king, Yahshua, They were trying to paint Paul and Silas as another type of revolutionary trying to stir up things in Thessalonica. Paul and Silas had to reassure that there would be no problem like that, and they could not return to Thessalonica. Read 1 Thessalonians now with this understanding, and Paul's letter becomes even more personal. He speaks about these things, and that's why he sent Timothy to see them. Paul and Silas then went to the city of Berea and tried to preach there. They were easier to speak to, and they received the word with all readiness and searched the scriptures daily to find out whether the things Paul preached were true, just as we should do today. They searched the scriptures diligently to make sure that they understood if Yahshua was truly the Messiah, which he is. But the haters that stirred up the trouble in Thessalonica came and did the same thing there in Berea, and Paul left and went to Athens. Let's see what happened there. Now while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him when he saw that the city was given over to idols. Therefore he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and with the Gentile worshippers, and in the marketplace daily with those who happened to be there. Then certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered him, and some said, "What does this babbler want to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods," because he preached to them Yahshua and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new doctrine is of which you speak? For you are bringing some strange things to our ears. Therefore, we want to know what these things mean." For all the Athenians and the foreigners who were there spent their time in nothing else, but either to tell or hear some new thing. Then Paul stood in the midst of Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious. For as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To the unknown God.' Therefore, the one whom you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you, Yahweh, who made the world and everything in it, since he is the done of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he worshipped with men's hands, as though he needed anything, since he gives to all life breath and all things. And he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings, so that they should seek the Adon, in the hope that they may reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as also some of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. Therefore, since we are the offspring of Elohim, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, something shaped by art and man's devising. Truly, these times of ignorance Elohim overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent, because he has appointed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by the man whom he has ordained. He has given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead. And when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, while others said, "We will hear you again on this matter." So Paul departed from among them. However, some men joined him and believed. Among them, Dionysius, the Areopagite, a woman named Damaris, and others with them. Okay, so not to keep repeating myself, but because there are so many naysayers, here is more concrete proof. Paul preached the gospel to pagans. He was greatly disturbed when he got to Athens and saw all the pagan temples and altars. People thought he was just teaching about some foreign god. The Areopagus was a hill called the Hill of Ares, the god of war. This was where the court was held concerning the questions of religion and morals. There were no limits to where Paul was taking the gospel. The gospel was being examined by pagans who were supposed experts of philosophy and religion. Paul knew his audience, so he did not start with the Hebrew scriptures. He knew they knew very little about them. He turned to the altar they had to the unknown God. He tailored his message to what they needed to understand at first. Many of the pagans mocked him, but others decided they would give what he was saying a little more attention. Some joined and believed. The gospel was preached to the pagans in Athens, Greece, in Acts chapter 17, proving everyone who says the gospel was only for Israel is not reading the scriptures fully. Let's continue. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome. He came to them. So because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked. For by occupation they were tent makers. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, Paul was compelled by the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Yahshua is the Messiah. But when they opposed him and blasphemed, he shook his garments and said to them, "Your blood be upon your heads. I am clean. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." And he departed from there and entered the house of a certain man named Justus, one who worshipped Elohim, whose house was next door to the synagogue. Then Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Adon with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized. Now the Adon spoke to Paul in the night by a vision. "Do not be afraid, but speak, and do not keep silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to hurt you, for I have many people in this city." And he continued there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of Yahweh among them. When Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat, saying, "This fellow persuades men to worship Elohim contrary to the law." And when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrongdoing or wicked crimes, O Jews, there would be reason why I should bear with you. But if it is a question of words and names and your own law, look to it yourselves, for I do not want to be a judge of such matters." And he drove them from the judgment seat. Then all the Jews took Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. But Gallio took no notice of these things. When you read this, you really see how diligent Paul was in spreading the gospel to the known world. He had a strategy for his ministry and conviction of the Holy Spirit. At this time, he was in Corinth. This is why there is the church or assembly of the Corinthians, in whom Paul also sent his 2 letters to. He stayed there 1.5 years. Corinth was the political capital of Achaia. It was also the center of worship of Aphrodite, the pagan goddess of fertility. It also housed the major temple of Apollo. It was rich in pagan beliefs and customs. Because of the worship they had of Aphrodite, Corinth had a reputation for being a city of immorality. When people worship the goddess of fertility, they perform in many immoral sexual activities. It's said that in the 5th century BC, the Greeks used a word meaning act like a Corinthian. They use this as a synonym for sexual immorality. This is why in Paul's letters to the Corinthians, he speaks a lot about sexual immorality. So in Corinth, the unbelieving Jews really made Paul's job difficult for him. They opposed him and blasphemed. Paul was so over it. He said that from then on, he would only be taking the gospel to the Gentiles there instead. Many today can understand this. Paul was told to stay there and not worry because Yahweh had many people there. So even when attempts and accusations were made against Paul, nothing came from it. The Jewish leaders thought they would take advantage of Paul and the gospel with the new proconsul. But Paul did not even have to open his mouth to defend the faith. Elohim already took care of Paul's defense through Gallio. Gallio considered the Christian faith to be a Jewish sect, therefore a Jewish problem. And the Jewish leader received the penalty that he was trying to place upon Paul. That must have been a big strength builder for Paul at the time. Let's continue reading. So Paul still remained a good while. Then he took leave of the brethren and sailed for Syria, and Priscilla and Aquila were with him. He had his hair cut off at Centuria, for he had taken a vow. And he came to Ephesus and left them there. But he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to stay a longer time with them, he did not consent, but took leave of them, saying, "I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem, but I will return again to you, Elohim willing." And he sailed from Ephesus, and when he landed at Caesarea and gone up and greeted the church, he went down to Antioch. After he had spent some time there, he departed and went over the region of Galatia and Phrygia in order, strengthening all the disciples. Now a certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexandria, an eloquent man and mighty in the scriptures, came to Ephesus. This man had been instructed in the way of the Adon, and being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things of the Adon, though he knew only the baptism of John. So he began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Aquila and Priscilla heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of Elohim more accurately. And when he desired to cross to Achaia, the brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him. And when he arrived, he greatly helped those who had believed through grace, for he vigorously refuted the Jews publicly, showing from the scriptures that Yahshua is the Messiah. Okay, Paul cut his hair as part of the Nazirite vow he had made. You can read about it in Numbers chapter 6. The vow had to be fulfilled in Jerusalem, where his hair would be presented to Elohim. As we continue reading, this is spoken about a little more in chapter 21, when Paul is actually in Jerusalem. The point is, Paul redirected his entire travel schedule because he wanted to get to Jerusalem in time to make this vow. During that time, he had entered Ephesus, again, where we see the church of Ephesus started. We see in this part of the scriptures how another Jew who believed in the gospel that was given to him, and he went back to Corinth to assist the assembly of believers. Remember, most of the believers in Corinth were Gentiles, so they had little knowledge of the Hebrew scriptures. So when the Jews came at them speaking what they felt to be truth, they had little defense because they were not strong in their understanding of the scriptures. But they had faith in Yahshua, which was most important. Having Apollos, a Jew who was strong in his understanding, going up to Corinth was a great assistance to the church. But you can understand when reading 1st and 2nd Corinthians why there is so much meat in those letters from Paul. They needed help and instruction because the Jews that were there rebelled against the gospel rather than help proclaim it. And that's what people need today, help and instruction because of all the naysayers and the people that are against the true gospel. So we will stop there because there's a lot more to discuss in Paul's journey as we start to conclude the book of Acts. Here's what you need to know from this part in the series. 1. So that we know of the gospel today, disciples and apostles like Paul were persecuted, threatened, beaten, imprisoned, falsely accused, cast out of cities, etc. This was the church. They sacrificed and endured a great deal for the kingdom of Elohim. 2. In Thessalonica, the Jews stirred up much trouble for Paul as he tried to preach the gospel, as very much like what people do today when they hear parts of the gospel that they do not want to accept. 3. In 49 AD, Roman Emperor Claudius expelled all Jews from Rome due to the riots that were ignited by a group of zealous Jews. They were plotting insurrection and revolution against Rome and were opposing the installation of a new king. 4. When the Jews accused Paul and Silas of acting contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying there's another king, Yahshua, they were trying to paint Paul and Silas as another type of revolutionary, trying to stir up Thessalonica. Paul and Silas had to reassure that there would be no problem like that, and they could not return to Thessalonica. 5. Acts chapter 17 is more concrete evidence of Paul bringing the gospel to Gentiles that are not possible to be identified with Israel. This chapter shows the gospel was preached to the pagans in Athens, Greece. 6. He presented the gospel at Areopagus, the court that discussed questions of religion and morals. There were no limits to where Paul was taking the gospel. The gospel was being examined by pagans who were supposed experts of philosophy and religion. 7. Paul tailored his message to what they needed to understand at first. Many of the pagans mocked him, but others decided that they would give what he was saying a little more attention. Some joined and believed. 8. Corinth was the political capital of Achaia. It was also the center of worship of Aphrodite, the pagan goddess of fertility. It also housed the major temple of Apollo. It was rich in pagan beliefs and customs. Because of the worship they had of Aphrodite, Corinth had a reputation for being a city of immorality. 9. This is why in Paul's letters to the Corinthians, he speaks a lot about sexual immorality. 10. In Corinth, the unbelieving Jews really made Paul's job difficult for him. They opposed him and blasphemed. Paul was so over it. He said he was just taking the gospel to the Gentiles there. The church in Corinth was primarily Gentiles. 11. Paul cut his hair as part of the Nazirite vow he had made. You could read about it in Numbers chapter 6. The vow had to be fulfilled in Jerusalem, where his hair would be presented to Elohim. 12. Paul redirected his entire travel schedule because he wanted to get to Jerusalem in time to make this vow. 13. You can understand when reading 1st and 2nd Corinthians why there is so much meat in those letters from Paul. They needed instruction because the Jews that were there rebelled against the gospel rather than help proclaim it. Apollos went there to help that assembly. This world is in definite need of the gospel. The days are growing darker, and the times are becoming more wicked. It is all of our jobs to be examples of the gospel and to spread it to those who need to hear it. It's truly time for the church to get off the sidelines and off the benches. When we look at the map of the Apostle Paul's missionary journeys and read some of the accounts of his ministry, it is a true testament to his devotion to Elohim. With all the persecution and challenges he faced, he stayed focused on his purpose. Because of him, the gospel was brought to many that never knew much about the Elohim of Israel. In these last days, we must pick up that mantle and be ready to proclaim the gospel to all who will listen. We must first have a strong understanding of it ourselves. Be ready to preach the good news to whoever is willing to hear it. We were all created for a purpose. We are vessels created to worship Yahweh, to proclaim His truths, and to live out His ways of righteousness. We can often defer to others and believe that proclaiming the gospel to the world is for others to do. But it is not. It is all of our responsibility. We just have different territories and markets. So as these times move forward towards dominion and worship of the beast, we must make sure that our oil lamps stay lit and we are a consistent light in a dark world. The enemy wants us distracted and lazy. He wants us to sit in church pews and keep our voices silent. We will easily protest and give a rebuttal to race and oppression, but we are silent to blaspheme and sin. Today, you must proclaim the truth. Tell the world that Yahshua is the Messiah. Tell those that will listen that redemption only comes through Him. There is no blending of faiths, and we do not worship the same God. Make the gospel your purpose. The world needs you. Okay, thanks for watching. If this has blessed you, please make sure to like it and share it with others. If you haven't already done so, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I upload every Friday. Make sure you follow this ministry on Facebook and Instagram. I also would like to sincerely thank all that donate and support this ministry. Thank you for allowing Yahweh to use you and being obedient to His voice on your heart. You truly bless me. You know who you are. Thanks for being a blessing. Okay, thanks again for watching, everyone. I love you all.